Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, looking this time at the year 1991. Now, why 1991? Well, as well as being a turning point in world history, it was also a suggested comment that I make this video from a previous video that I made about 3 or 4 years ago, when I did a series about the different census years. So 1951, 61, etc., etc. But I never got to 1991. So I made my promise and I'm gonna do it. So here's a video about the year 1991. In the year 1989, just a couple of years before, the Berlin Wall was falling and Eastern Germany was becoming an independent state, soon to be unified with its Western brother by 1990. And in that same year of 1990, a lot of other Eastern European countries were deciding that they too wanted a slice of this independent pie. So the ruling parties in all of these Eastern European countries decided that they were going to give out a few more liberties to its peoples, recognizing that the world was changing and that people needed to be free. Take, for example, Albania. In December of 1990, the ruling Workers' Party decided to open up their elections so that more parties could partake and so that more choice was given to the people of Albania. On the 11th of December 1990, just one day after this announcement, a new Democratic Party was formed, ready for a new election that was going to be held in 1991. But this wasn't without controversy. There were confrontations and military force being used in nations like Latvia and Lithuania in the January of 1991. There was an election in Albania at the end of March of 1991, but it found that highest top voted was again the ruling Workers' Party. There were protests in the streets, and so the ruling party decided by the June of that year to secede their grip on the Albanian government and hold new elections in the March of 1992, bringing up the Democratic Party this time as top voted. Now, Yugoslavia has always been an independent nation, despite also being led by a communist regime. But their road to independence was less of a rickety bridge and more of a choppy seas. There were long and lengthy clashes, military battles, and wars fought for the independence of individual nations. In fact, Yugoslavia broke up by the mid-1990s, splitting itself into a number of modern-day nations: Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, the North Macedonia as well. So the 1990s was filled with numerous conflicts happening in Eastern Europe between Croats and Slovenians. Bosnia had a big war during the early to mid 1990s, and of course clashes in Kosovo as well. But for the most part, the nations of Eastern Europe took to the transition from communism to a democratic system with relative ease, save for a few rickety moments, but a relatively easy transition. The USSR decided to dissolve its commie-con system, its own communist economic system that was a collaborative group of communist nations on economic terms. They dissolved that on the 28th of June, and just a few short days later, they dissolved the Warsaw Pact, again this community of communist nations under political affiliations. But not only was this a moment for independence for Eastern European countries, this was also a moment when the USSR, the old Soviet Union, collapsed and a number of breakaway states took their own independence steps. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the nation of Georgia. These nations still have ties to the now Russian state, and in some cases Belarus have very, very close ties to Russia. But for the most part, these independent nations are, as I've described, independent, free to choose however they wish. Now, the final moment in this story, this part of our story, is the collapse of the old Soviet Union state and the rising, like a phoenix, of the Russian Federation on the 26th of December 1991. The Russian Federation was going to sort of revert back, almost, to how it was previous to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the establishment of the Soviet Union. It had renamed Leningrad, Stalingrad, back to its former name of St. Petersburg. Now, the first president of this new Russian Federation was Boris Yeltsin, who had already been elected on the 12th of June 91 as a sort of a transitional leader, taking away some of the responsibilities from the head of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin had already survived a coup made against him and his political system in the late August of 91, and served as the first Russian president until the year 2000, and his successor was Vladimir Putin. Now, the island nation of Haiti was going through its own transition from dictatorship to a democratic system under a new president that had been elected in rounds of voting between the December of 1990 and the January of 1991. President Jean-Bertrand was sworn in as the president of Haiti on the 7th of February 1991. But the president's tenure didn't last very long. A number of protests had occurred throughout the year 1991, resulting in a final coup d'etat and deposing of the president, returning Haiti back to a military rule under the de facto leader Raúl Cedras, who would be the de facto leader until 1994. President Aristide was then invited back and became the president once again until 1996, and then holding the office again between 2001 and 2004. The second big major event out of 1991 was Operation Desert Storm, which was the sort of concluding chapter to a much larger Gulf War conflict that had started all the way back in August of 1990. That was when the Iraqi forces under the leadership of Saddam Hussein invaded its neighboring nation of Kuwait. This was highly criticized by the United Nations, who set out a number of resolutions basically imploring Saddam Hussein to withdraw his Iraqi armed forces, retain the old existing national borders, and basically never do that again, never try to invade Kuwait again. The deadline for these resolutions was the 15th of January. The deadline was passed, and so one of the largest armed coalitions since the Second World War was formed, mostly made up of the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, but it was a UN coalition, of course, that basically forced Iraqi forces out of Kuwaiti territory. In mid-June 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines created the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. Unfortunately, it took the lives of 800 people, and it cooled the global temperature by 0.4 degrees. But this wasn't exactly a surprise event, because 2 weeks before the eruption, there had been a massive build-up of tension underground, so it was just an inevitability of the eruption happening. And for the year previous to this massive volcanic eruption of Mount Pinatubo, there had been mini earthquakes, seismic events that were pointing to a build-up towards what was this big event. Considered one of the greatest racing drivers of Formula One, Michael Schumacher made his racing debut at the Belgian Grand Prix on the 25th of August. He didn't win it, he would actually win in the following year at the same Belgian Grand Prix, and his career would span up until the year 2012, winning 7 world titles between 1994 and 2004. Now, the art world held its breath for about 35 minutes in the early hours of April the 14th, as 20 Vincent van Gogh paintings were stolen from their museum spots in Amsterdam. For 35 minutes, there was a rush to try and find the thieves and robbers that had taken these paintings. The paintings were recovered in an abandoned car 35 minutes later. The music world lost an icon in the form of Freddie Mercury, the frontman of Queen, on the 24th of November 1991, after a long battle with the disease AIDS. In the UK, following Freddie Mercury's passing, the Queen's most famous song, Bohemian Rhapsody, shot back up to the top of the charts and has since become the 3rd best-selling single of all time, and cementing Queen's legacy as music icons that had begun all the way back in the early 1970s. On the 2nd of July 1991, UK Prime Minister John Major was sitting in 10 Downing Street discussing the Gulf War with his cabinet, his government ministers, when there was a large explosion quite close by. It had turned out that the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, had shot a mortar intended for 10 Downing Street to assassinate the Prime Minister and his government. There were similar attacks 2 weeks later on the 18th of July, when bombs were set off at London's Paddington and London Victoria train stations. A conflict that had been rumbling throughout the 1970s, 80s, and now into the 1990s would not conclude until the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The third big event of 1991 is the end to apartheid in South Africa. Now, the formal conclusion of apartheid is the repealing of the 1950 Population Registration Act, which occurred on the 17th of June 1991. This 1950 Act had been put in place to separate the different races and ethnicities living within South Africa. It was basically an identity system and classification based on certain characteristics, hair colour, skin colour, etc. And this act really gave definition to what apartheid actually was, that separateness, that separation between the different races within South Africa. And whilst some of the aspects to this apartheid and 1950 Act sort of lingered on throughout the early 1990s, certain repeals and reforms have been made, or were made exactly. Land ownership had only been exclusively the privilege for white communities. By 1991, anyone could own land within South Africa. There were certain taxes that were repealed or reformed, and representation within government was a big driving force within the 1994 election, when Nelson Mandela became the first black president for the nation, and really symbolising the changes that had been made since the end of apartheid. Following its independence on the 24th of August 1991, the Ukraine, towards the end of that year, decided to pass a law decriminalizing homosexuality. It was actually the first post-Soviet state to do so. It's a law that still remains to this very day. In the United States, you have what is known as the Supreme Court, made up of 8 justices who dispel out the highest form of United States law and reforms. These positions are usually granted and appointed by the United States President, and you serve as a justice until you pass away or you decide to retire. Probably one of the most famous and most recognizable of these Supreme Court justices, Thurgood Marshall, decided that in 1991 he was going to retire after 24 years in post. He was a great civil rights campaigner and the first African-American Supreme Court Justice nominee. He was appointed in 1967 by Lyndon B. Johnson. Thurgood Marshall had always stressed that he would never retire from his position as Justice of the Supreme Court. But when 1991 rolled around, he decided that he was getting too old and he was, quote, falling apart. He passed away, sadly, on the 24th of January 1993, just a year and a half after his retirement back in 1991. He leaves a legacy of not only civil rights campaigning, but a legacy within the numerous cases that he fought for in the Supreme Court, winning 27 out of 32 cases that he was presided over. And that is the end of our year 1991. I hope that you have enjoyed this little short form bit of content or little snippets from that very momentous year, a turning point in history. Thank you for watching today's video, and I hope to see you in the next one. See you later. Oh, and thank you to the subscriber who suggested this video. Much appreciated. If you want to make any other suggestions, that would equally be helpful and nice. Bye.